Can we start?
Yes.
Enjoy your second cup of coffee.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Second cup of coffee. Okay. Good morning, everyone. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Selamat pagi, Bapak Ibu sekalian, dan juga tentunya salam hormat kepada Kaprodi Magister Bioetika Bu Siwi dan of course Prof Dick William as our special lecturer today, and also Bu Puri, salah satu alumni, kalau rekan-rekan alumni pertama ya, alumni pertama kita, Bu Puri yang juga sudah selesai doktoralnya bulan lalu ya, Bu Puri ya. So congratulations for your doctoral degree. Okay, so today we have a special session, and thank you very much for coming back here for all students. And we have a one session with Prof. Jibril. This is one of our meetings in basic on bioethics. So one subject that you have learned this semester, and we have one session with Prof. Jik, and also of course we have one session in other subject, which is bioethics on contemporary issue. Yeah, maybe in online course. For today, we will discuss about bioethics as a scientific discipline. So let's discuss with Prof. Dick, and let's enjoy for this session. Thank you, Prof. Dick. You can start for your session.
Thank you very much. Selamat pagi, everybody. Really nice to see you all back morning. The topic that I've been asked to speak about this morning is about ethics as a scientific discipline. So not only as a philosophical discipline, but as a scientific discipline. So can you slide? I'm going to talk mainly about the subject of what we call empirical ethics. And I think that's quite a recent development in bioethics, that we have become more and more empirical and did more and more empirical studies. So what I will do now is start by making the distinction between empirical and empirical ethics, and then I will explain a few of this that we've done in Amsterdam and also in different places, and so discuss some of the characteristics, and I'll also address some of the methodologies, let's say, so some of the possibilities how you can study empirical issues in an empirical way, because that is the essence of ethics as an empirical discipline. So maybe just about the timing. I think we have until 11. Is that true? Yeah. Yes. And do you want anything like a break or something? Do we need like a sanitary? Shall I take a break in about 3/4 of an hour or so? Yes. Yeah. 10 minutes? Yeah, so like 10 minutes after, maybe at about 10 after 10 or something. So I'll stop at a place where I can stop. Yeah. Okay, so this is a small table where you have two forms of ethics, the way you do ethics. So the first one is empirical, and empirical ethics you can do in two ways, largely in two ways. It can be either quantitative or qualitative studies, and I think both are important for ethics. So I'm personally a little bit more involved in qualitative research, but I've also participated in quantitative research in ethics. So I'll explain a little bit about that, and I think I almost make a distinction also in types of questions that you can ask. So you can ask questions about ethical dilemmas. So how do you solve ethical dilemmas? That's one form of ethical question, and the other one is asking what is good in a certain situation. So for instance, what is a good life and what's good care in certain situations? Out there don't have to be dilemmas really. So in this part you have empirical studies of dilemmas. For instance, one of the studies that we did in Amsterdam was a study on the way physicians were dealing with hope in the terminal phase of a disease. So you see sometimes patients keep having hopes of cure even though the doctors are certain that there is no hope anymore and that the patient is going to die. So one of the things that doctors sometimes wrestle with is what they should do. Should they support the hope of the patient, so be hopeful with them, or should they tell them what they think is the real truth, is that they are going to die? So that's the dilemma that many physicians and nurses face. Do I tell the truth, or do I keep up the hope of the patient, even though it is not realistic? So what we did was an investigation involving both patients and doctors, and we did that in one of my PhD students did it in the Netherlands and in Canada. He did a comparative study between those two countries, and he asked physicians and also patients what they thought was the best way of dealing with unrealistic hopes of patients. So it was, the focus was really unrealistic hope. So that's one thing that you can study empirically. So we did about, I think, 30, 40 interviews in every country. And it was also sitting in consultations and watching and doing an ethnographic study. And so finally, and I think very briefly, the result was that it's often better for the patient to gradually explain what the reality is. You don't break up the hope in a you don't really cut off the hope, but you keep up the hope, but you also explain what the real prospect is. So gradually you tend to and also what some of the physicians did is that they tried to move the hope from cure to having a good last phase of life. So what they said, you shouldn't hope for cure, but you can hope for a last phase of life that has beautiful and important things for you. So that was a bit, very briefly, of the PhD thesis. So that's one thing you can do. You can also ask, and I'll come back to that example later on a little bit. So how do patients, even if you don't have a dilemma, but you just want to know how patients who are dependent on medical technology, a very advanced medical technology, how they still have a good life? Because sometimes it's very difficult for us who are walking around freely and don't have, let's say, a ventilator or something to carry around. It's very difficult to imagine how you can still be good and fruitful and you still can have fun and be happy. So that was the question of another study that we did long ago. So that's empirical. That's how you deal with those things empirically. You just go there and you ask people how they do it. Non-empirical research, we also sometimes call it desk research. You don't go out into the world, you don't do interviews, or you don't do, but you study books or papers or articles. So that's what we call the non-empirical way of doing ethics. And I think I'm speaking most about empirical, so scientific ethics, but I think non-empirical ethics is very important because it's very important for sharpening our ways of thinking. And I'll give you an example of how it can help to think about so if you would still about hope, it would be you would have a different question. So basically what's important is the type of questions that you have. If your question is about how we should solve the dilemma, then I think you do empirical research. But if your question is, what is the essence of hope? What is central to hope in people? Then it's sometimes better to do non-empirical research. So to study the literature and study what philosophers have spoken about hope, what they've been saying about hope, and how important it is for people to have hope, but also how important it is to be realistic sometimes. So then what you can then do is study the literature about hope. And you don't do interviews then, but and I think one of the very interesting ways in which some people do non-empirical bioethics is studying novels and stories, and sometimes even poetry. I don't know if you ever heard the name of the American philosopher Martha Nussbaum. Do you do things with Martha Nussbaum? She's done very beautiful things analyzing theater plays and analyzing what they were saying about how you should solve difficult issues. So that's maybe a very rich source of thinking about, for instance, things like hope or responsibility. She's done really nice things using novels. So another question that you may ask, also from the literature, so not empirical, but from the literature, is, for instance, what's the good life according to Aristotle? You know, Aristotle, the Greek philosopher, he wrote a lot about what a good life is and what is part of a good life, but he also wrote about other virtues, like what a good doctor is and well, doctors, I don't know. I don't need to hear about doctors. But he did write about what a good general is, or a good emperor. So if you want to know more about that, then you can read Aristotle. And you could also do interviews maybe, but I think non-empirical research is more appropriate there. Give the next one. So I think to come back to the non-empirical part. So that's not the thing that's not my main subject, was just to make a contrast with ethics as a scientific discipline. It's a non-empirical ethics, says ethics is usually part of either philosophy or theology, one of those two disciplines. And the emphasis there is on analysis, and on the concepts that you use. So you could think about, like I already said, an example is a concept like hope. What does it mean? What's in the concept? So it's more of a conceptual analysis. And what's interesting is that many empirical philosophers, they use what we call counterfactuals. Do you know what counterfactuals are? A counterfactual is a situation that doesn't exist in the real world. So it's not factual. It's not a fact, but it's a setup, like a sort of an enigma, something that you invent to think things. It's a thinking tool, in fact, the counterfactual. And there's a very famous example. And yesterday I mentioned the name of Kant, the German philosopher, you remember? Maybe, I hope, because it's an important name. And he had this counterfactual. He said, suppose someone rings your doorbell. That person comes to your door, is very scared, is in a, and is chased by a murderer. That's why that person's chased by a murderer. So you let him in and you close the door to protect him from the murderer. And then obviously the murderer rings your bell and asks you if that person is in your house. So this is not a real situation. It never happened to Kant. It maybe never happened to anyone. I'm not sure. But his question is about is it ever justifiable to lie? So he asks, can we ever lie and justify our lies? So the question here is, what do you say? Do you say to the murderer, never seen that guy? Or do you say to the murderer, yes, he's in my home? Who would say, I've never seen that guy? Ah, good. Yeah, we have some liars here. Yeah, that's very nice. And who would say, yes, he's here? I think Tiwi will say that. Oh, no. No.
Maybe.
Maybe. Yeah. So, and nobody raises his hand. No. And still, Kant said, you have to say he's in. Because a lie is never accepted. And maybe you remember, I'm making it maybe a bit complicated, but maybe you remember the general rule that Kant had. The general rule was that he said your behavior should be the general rule for everybody. He said if you start lying, then everybody has the right to lie, if it's a general rule. And then society and living together becomes impossible if we can't trust other people. So he said we need to be able to trust other people. And that's why we cannot lie, even in these cases. So then, what would come? Imagine if this was kind. So he would say, yes, yeah, you're right, he's inside. And then he has maybe to pay for it with his, because he has to keep the murderer out, of course. So that was the consequence. And Kant, well, the easy thing about counterfactuals, so things that don't really exist, you can say these things because they don't have a consequence. I think he went to live about 90 years. He never had to face a murderer who murdered him because he was doing this. It's a very famous example. There's another famous example that you may have heard of also, and that's an example that's used quite often to show the difference between ethical difference between letting die someone and killing them. Now I'll explain. I don't have a slide, so you just have to listen. I hope I can explain it without the slide. It's called I think the tramway dilemma. It's by Philippa Foot. Maybe some of you have heard about it. It's a dilemma that says the following. There's a train that arrives at speed and it cannot be stopped. It's a loose train. They lost the possibility to stop it, and there's a way with two branches, and on one of the branches there are 5 people who can't get away, so they're tied to the road. And on the other branch is 1 person. And you're sitting there and you can decide which branch the train will take. The train cannot be stopped, but it has to take 1 or 2 branches. So you have a branch with 5 and you have a branch with 1. Which one do you take? So which one do you take? Does anybody have an answer? This always, this never happens. So you can say anything. It will never happen. So who would take the 5 branch where there are 5 people? I see no fingers, not even 2. And who would take the branch where there's 1 person? So nobody would do anything. Yeah, that's the other possibility, of course. You just let it happen. So you let the train choose, in fact. Let the train choose. Makes sense, maybe. So it's not your responsibility. I mean, this is about responsibility. Do you take the responsibility? And I see from the fact that you don't take an answer, that you don't take responsibility. Yeah, well, then you can do that. Because it's not your fault that the train is running on, so you don't take the responsibility. But then the train will choose the 5%. Which is, let's say that it's that at the moment that we're talking about the what's it called? The chain, it is put in a way that it will go to the 5. But you have the possibility to change it. So you don't, so you see, you know that that's going to happen, but you have a possibility to go to the 1, the branch where there's just 1 person. Who would do that? Still no.
Yeah.
Some people now think, yes, I can save 4 people or 5 people by sacrificing 1. You. And there's also, I often discuss this with students. There's always students who say, it depends who's on the tracks.
Yeah.
If it's my mother,
Yeah.
who's the 1, and there are 5 unknown people who are on the 5 track, I may not choose the 1. Yeah, I may not choose my mother. And I think it makes a lot of sense to say that. Yeah. So you can be very calculating and say 5 is more than 1, so I take 5. Oh, I take 1. But if it's your mother or your father, it makes it a lot more difficult. So this is Philippa Foot's original dilemma, which was to show that to show how difficult it is to take responsibility for things. That you're not the original cause, but you still have a responsibility. You didn't cause the train to come, but you still have a responsibility. And that's what doctors usually have. They didn't cause the disease, but they have the responsibility, even though. But now she complicated things a little bit more. Now it's a bit different. It's a similar situation. The train is still coming. You can't stop it, but there's just 1 track. There's not 2 tracks. There's just 1 track. And but on the track there's 5. But you're standing on a bridge now, and to your side it becomes a bit fantastical. But to your side there is a very heavy gentleman who's so heavy that he may be able to stop the train. And he's not aware of you. And you could push him off the bridge in front of the train so that he would stop the train. And you would save people by pushing that gentleman on the train. But it becomes more and more fantastic. It will never, ever happen. But then still the question is, what would you do? Would you do it? Would you push that person, or would you let the train go? I'm not going to ask you again because I know you won't lift your hands. Nobody's going to take this, because this is even more serious. And almost nobody says, I'm going to push the person. And the reason, of course, for that is that it makes you more responsible. You do something that really kills that person. You push him off. And that's, while in the first example, you were not actively killing someone, you were just choosing between a number of people who would be, there's a killing, someone would get killed anyway. But now you push someone who was not even going to be killed. So that's the responsibility that nobody wants to take. And she used these examples to show how responsibility changes in different situations. So to show the complexity of the concept of responsibility. So this is to show you how important it can be to non-empirical ethics. So I'm not against non-empirical ethics, but I'm going to speak about empirical studies more. One of the last that's usually important in non-empirical ethics is that they talk a lot about what's called meta-ethics. Did you hear anything about meta-ethics in the course? Meta ethics, in fact, the way it is thinking about what ethics is and what a good ethical reasoning is. So it's one level up, let me say. So it's thinking about ethics, so not doing ethics, but thinking about it. And in non-empirical ethics, people they talk about is an ethical statement true or not? Is it a true statement, or is it like an order, or is it something? So that's the kind of question. It's a different subject. It's quite interesting, but it's a different subject. So can I have the next one? Just a little bit more, maybe what's also often used in a non-empirical way, I would say, is the way you apply ethical principles. So you don't, if you get a dilemma and you use the 4 principles that we often use, then in fact that's not, you don't do a study, you're not doing scientific study into a dilemma, but you apply principles. That's also a form of non-scientific ethics. It's important, but it's not scientific. So, and I think there's one thing I'd like to mention, which is behind this whole discussion of empirical or non-empirical ethics. And that's something that was said by the 18th century British or Scottish philosopher David Hume. You see him here. He's quite friendly, isn't he? But he's also impressive, I think. And David Hume said, and that's something I think you need to recall if you're thinking about ethics. He said you can never deduce what an ought from an is. He said, but that's a bit of old-fashioned English. You can never deduce what you should do from how the world is. So, in fact, to make it a bit more practical, you can never say that the world has always been like this, so it should be like this. And I think that's an important way of thinking about ethics, because he said if you do that, then you will always stick to the same rules and there will be no development. So you can deduce how the world should be only from how it is. So there's always value judgments. That's in fact what he was saying. You always have a value judgment. You cannot, it's not because it has been always like this that it should remain always like this. Also because you think it's better. So this is in fact what I wanted to say about non-empirical ethics. And maybe you should bit about what Jung was saying, because well, sometimes we have examples like that. Like tradition, many people, when you ask them ethical questions, they go to traditions and they say, we're used to doing this, so this is the good way. And then Jung would say, no, tradition is not enough. You also have to think about whether it's really good or better to do it. It's not enough. He doesn't say you should drop it, it's not important, but he says it's not enough. All right, next. So what's the fundamental? Now I go to empirical ethics. This is all I will say about philosophy and theology. I do ethics as a scientific discipline, not as a philosophical discipline, but as a scientific discipline, even though there's a relation between the two, but I'm talking about ethics as a science. So what it is briefly, it's the empirical study into how good things or good care or good life or good action is thought about and practiced within practices such as care or research or prevention or even healthcare management. We were talking with I think a lot about the ethics of healthcare management. And he says, and I think he's right, that there's not enough people thinking about the ethics of management decisions in hospitals. Maybe that's something you can do in your bioethics master also. I think it's an important subject. So all of this you can do using empirical ethics methods. So You can try to study how managers take their decisions and what kind of decisions and what their idea about good things about the good is. So every, let's say, practice, whether it's healthcare or management, can be studied using empirical ethics approaches. Should be studied that way. Maybe next one. So the question could be, why do we do that? Why is it not enough to do ethics with the examples that like Kant had them and like the runaway train of Philippa Foot? Why do we need to do empirical studies? And why do you do empirical studies during the Master of Bioethics? I think it's good to think about it. We do that. I think there's several reasons. One of them is that there is a development in principles and in norms. So societies change. So also the principles that we use and that are basic to our behavior and the values that people have changed. So you have to be aware of the change. I'll give you a very simple example. I'm sometimes still a bit surprised how the value of privacy changed during the last decades. I don't know here, but in Holland, on almost every street corner, there were phone booths. You know what a phone booth? You don't even know because you don't have them anymore. It's these separate little buildings where you can make phone calls. And people at that time, that's about, I think, I've seen that. To make a phone call, people went into these little buildings so that other people couldn't hear them. Because the value of privacy was so important that they didn't want people to overhear their telephone calls. That's completely changed. That value has completely disappeared. People make loud phone calls in trains, in buses, in the streets. I'm still sometimes a bit surprised seeing people walking through the streets crying out loud, and you don't see anybody else because they're talking to their phone, which is somewhere covered in there. But just to show you that values with new technologies, we have different value judgments. So people don't value that type of privacy. They still find privacy important, but not in this way. So the value of being separated from others has disappeared. So that's the reason why you need to be empirical about ethics. You need to know how these value changes occur. And there are many more examples of how that happens. The second is the philosophical reason. Because I told you that David Hume said you cannot deduce values and norms from how the world is. John Searle, an recent American philosopher from the 20th century, he said that's not true. We do deduce things about what we value from how the world is. And here, I mean, when we do empirical studies, we're interested in the values that people have. And that's an empirical question. It's a question about how the world is now, because values are part of the world. They're not separate from it. So that's the argument of Searle against what you say. One of the other reasons to do empirical research, which I think is important, is we have these 4 principles, but they're very, very high up. So these are the big concepts like autonomy and beneficence and non-maleficence and justice that you've heard over and over again, probably in the course. And it's so what's happening in practice is always more complicated and more complex. So the principles are a lot too abstract to have an easy application. So you need to look at the practice where they use it, where they have to use it. So the question becomes, how do you apply the principle of autonomy that we were talking about yesterday in a nursing home where you have a lot of people with Alzheimer's. And that makes it into an imperative. So as I already said, new technology, smartphones and Bluetooth earphones make the work, introduce new values and new ways of looking at values, but also something like, for instance, one of the things that when I started doing bioethics, there was nothing similar to fetal therapy that we have now. As you know, we can now treat fetuses while they're still in the womb of a woman, and that didn't exist at the time when I was studying bioethics. So it raises a whole new series of ethical questions were non-existing before. So you need to study that practice to see what new questions come up with the new technology. And the last reason I think why empirical research is important is that attention is shifting from studies of what we call the big issues like euthanasia, abortion, or genetics, and also look at very everyday practices. So practices like how do you manage a waiting list? What's a good way to manage a waiting list? Who gets priority? Who doesn't get it on a waiting list? That's an ethical question because it's about justice, but it's very down to earth. It's not spectacular. Euthanasia is a lot more spectacular, I think, for most people. But we're not only discussing that because we realize that ethics is also in these very small things. It's not only in the big issue. Okay. Any questions? I didn't tell you, but I think you know. If you have any questions, just ask them. Does anyone have a question about it so far?
Question? Yeah. Sebenarnya what?
Yeah, go ahead, please. Yeah. Can you give her a mic? Give it back. I won't throw this microphone.
Okay, thank you for the chance. I would just want to ask about in your lecture, I think you want to say that if we should balance about non-empirical ethics and empirical ethics is tough. But in the real life, maybe we should pursue empirical ethics because our society changed. My question is, we have to stick to the principles, and when we have to modify principles, what situation we should apply?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I mean, can we? And there's something, there's something between. You ask whether we should, whether there's situations where you have to really change a principle, and maybe drop a principle and take another principle, something like that. Yeah, I think it's a very important question. Most of the time, what we do in these empirical studies is slightly modify a principle or make a principle a bit more refined. In this or that situation, you can use the principle in a different way. An example maybe would be that if you study autonomy, then usually you're talking about the individual autonomy, as I said yesterday. But in some situations that you study, you can say we also think we talk about autonomy if the family is the one who speaks for the patient. So you slightly modify the principle of autonomy. So I think that usually we don't completely drop the principles, but we modify them a little bit to make them fit the situation that we're studying. So it's a more form of adaptation of the principle but you still stick to the principle. So you still find autonomy important, even though in this situation you have a different way of doing it. So that's in fact what you're doing. So you're not completely moving away from the principle, but you're adapting the principle to so that it fits the situation. Is that an answer to your question? Or yeah.
But how we know if our modification is right or correct?
Yeah. Well, we know that from the data that we have. So we study a practice and then we say we will this in this form fits to the practice, so that makes it correct. But it's also, I mean, and that's a good question. I mean, it's also that it should remain consistent, the general idea. So you also do, let's say, the non-empirical analysis of what the concept means, and if it's still if it is not contradictory with the original version. So it should remain consistent, but it should also adapt it. So that's how you know it's correct. I mean, it's a little bit abstract maybe, but it should still be autonomy. If I talk about autonomy, or it should justice. So you know it's correct also by testing it. So you can afterwards you can try to apply, let's say, the new version of the principle in the practice and see if it has the results that you want. So you can test the new version of the principle and see if it does. Yeah, it's a little bit abstract maybe, but that's the way it is. Yeah, that's the way to use it. Very good questions. Yeah. Is there anything else? I like this type of questions that make it a bit no. So, no, not for the moment. You can also, if you have something, you don't have to wait for me to ask you. You can also raise your hand. I prefer you doing that. Yeah.
Thank you,
Oh,
Prof.
thank you. Yeah.
Okay. I would like to ask about the case study earlier about the choose between having 5 people or 1 people. Because whatever decision we make responsibility for the ways to choose. Okay. And then how can we as bioethicists act appropriately and minimize subjective bias in decision making? Okay. Thank you.
Okay, yes, okay. Can I repeat? You know, you ask how we justify our responsibility and not and have no subjective bias.
Jadi, how to minimize to bias subjective decision making?
Right.
Choose
Yeah.
the way
Yeah.
5 or
Yeah.
okay.
Okay. Thank you very much for that question too. I think there's just one way to do that, and that's to do it together. Never take decisions like this. I mean, in the example of the runaway train, there was no time for a moral case deliberation. And you couldn't just gather people around and talk for an hour to see what you would do, because the runaway train had already killed 5 people. So there's no. But usually, when we have this type of ethical issues, we try to diminish by as much as we can by doing a moral case deliberation. Yes, so we involve other people who may have other subjective biases, because as human beings, we always have subjective biases. We cannot do differently. And that's so, you know, I was saying, when your mother is on the one track, what are you going to do? That's a very clear example. But we have bias in favor of our group. So maybe so there's a lot of bias. You may have all kinds of reasons. So the best way to stop bias to play a role is by introducing the biases of everybody, and so they balance out. You know, so that's the way. So and in the case, if it's a case in an emergency situation such as the runaway train, then you do that moral consideration afterwards to learn from it. Because you don't have to do it in the emergency situation, you have to make a choice. But then you would have a moral consideration afterwards to see if your choice was very biased or whether it was the maybe closer to the right one. It links a lot to the first one. So how do you know you take the right decision? And the only way to do that is by involving other people. And possibly diverse. So not only people from my group or from, and that's sometimes difficult. So it helps very much to have people who have completely other values. All right, thank you. Yeah. Okay. Maybe I'll take 5 more minutes and then we'll. Okay. So this is maybe a bit repetitive, but that's sometimes helpful to repeat things. So empirical ethics is ethics that takes values to be part of the world, and it's not above the world, but you have to find them in the way people do a practice, the way people make choices in a practice. So you have to look at the values in the world. So it's not something you do only in the library, but or somewhere above the world, but you do it in the world. And there was a time when people said that empirical ethics was, they also called that descriptive ethics. And they distinguished it from normative ethics. So they said you describe first, and then you apply your principles. I think what's a very important basic idea here is that empirical ethics descriptive and normative at the same time. So it's not first a description and then apply norms, but it is a way to deduce, to find the norms in the practice that you study. And that's I think a crucial difference with what was called descriptive ethics earlier. So it's the values that we articulate, and it's also, what we value, what is normative, is the kind of practice that we start studying. We wouldn't do an empirical ethics study if we weren't worried about something, and worries are always partly because you have values. So it's and what I really like to stress also is that I started really in doing non-empirical bioethical research. So I was studying mainly books and articles and deducing things and trying to make new reasonings about value. But I find empirical studies are much more fun, are really nicer to do because you meet people and you talk with them and they have often surprising views. Whereas if you stay in the books, you'll only have the views of, let's say, the academic people. And I'm often very surprised at looking at how non-academic people from all walks of life solve their ethical issue. Also doctors, of course. So they have they're usually much more creative. So it's a lot of fun to do empirical research. So maybe we'll stop here for the break with the idea that doing empirical ethics is maybe more fun than doing non-empirical ethics in the end. So let's break up. So we break up for about 10 minutes. Yeah, and then we'll go back and get with you and do the second part. And I'll have a few more examples of the studies that we've done in Amsterdam in empirical.
Okay, thank you, Prof. Dick. We will have a break, maybe 5 to 10 minutes. Like Prof. Dick said, a lot of fun in empirical research. Yeah, I hope empirical ethics. Yeah, I hope all students will enjoy for this empirical ethics. Yeah, Prof. Yeah. Okay, so like a break in 5 minutes. Yeah, after this we can continue. Okay, bye. Goodbye.
baptisan dua praksi, dua uji, gimana biasanya? Iya. Betul berapa? Betul berapa dia yang baca? Ini ini kalau bahasa ini. Oh, beda. Iya. Iya. Oh, iya, maksudnya foto namanya gitu. Iya, tidak ada lagi apa ya? Iya. Dibuat dari banyak komunitas bukan dia sampai dia di itu kan satu dia pasti ini sendiri iya anggapannya begitu Kalau yang kemarin
Oh, ya,
Para PP yang
I think I have to draw some things. I'll start here. I'll skip a few. So I hope everybody's back in, and we'll get a bit more into detail about how you can do empirical research. I know some of you already did that for your master, for your thesis, but I'm trying to give an overview. So, oh, that's the old. That's the one. Yeah, but I have some difference. No. Yeah, this is one. No, yeah. So I'm always stressing very much, if you start doing empirical research in bioethics, like in any form of scientific research, the crucial thing is that you have clear problems and questions. Many people just start out and think we're going to look into, let's say, the palliative care, and we just even look. If you don't have a precise problem and precise questions, then you will lose the focus, and your research in the end will be about nothing. It will be about everything, and that means it's about nothing. So you have to start with really clear problems. And one of the things I'd like to stress is the best research based on a concern or a worry, something you're worried about. So because you can study really everything in the world, but it's important that it's a genuine thing that you think needs to be solved, a genuine worry. So that's where it starts. So I have an example here. We did a lot of research in Amsterdam about palliative care, about advanced care planning, things like that. And one of the main worries in some of the studies is that doctors don't speak about the end of life with patients when they should do it, not at the right moment. They wait too long. They sometimes never speak with patients about end of life. So that's the main concern. It's not good for patients because they may die in a bad way because nobody talks about it. So that was the concern that we start with. And then the problem, that's usually how you build up an argument. You start with a problem, and then you say this problem leads to the following questions. And we're going to answer these questions, because doing empirical research is answering questions. So you have to have, at the end of the introduction of your research, you'll have to have sentences with question marks. And I always say, if you don't have question marks, you're not doing research. Then you're just talking about things. You can talk about things. Don't do research then. So always put in question marks, things you don't know. Why is this why is this way? Why do people behave this way? And there are different forms of scientific questions in ethics research. One of them, in the example of the doctors not talking about the end of life, is the causal question. Why don't they do it? So you can look into their psychology first. One of the answers could be that they're afraid of death themselves, so they don't have the courage to talk about end of life. So that's one of the questions you can ask. Why don't they do it? You can also ask about values. So what values are behind this problem? Do they think it's a bad thing to talk about? And for instance, some doctors say we don't talk about end of life because we value hope. So we value that people keep hoping to live on. So we're not talking. So there's some value. And it's important to investigate those values, to know about that, if to do something about the problem. And you can also ask questions about that could solve the problem. So what do they need? What are the obstacles? If they want to talk about the end of life, but they still don't do it, there are obstacles that you may need to take away. And also what I would call proper ethical questions, which are questions about what is a good way to talk about patients, and what's a bad one, which one is good and what's bad. And well, the demographic questions are about. And what's interesting, what's important, I think, is that different questions invoke different methods. I think more generally, if you make a causal question, then you often need a quantitative method. If you want to know about what's in general the cause of not speaking about the end of life, you'll need to do some quantitative investigation. Again, the next one, please. So, well, this is a bit maybe the same. What's the best way to solve an ethical problem? That's what the type of ethical questions that we try to raise. And we don't ask, we ask the people who are in the practice how they do it, or we look at how they do it. So we're not asking other people, but we're talking and we're investigating the way the people who are in the practice, how they do it. And next one. So, well, this I think is you can take the next one. So now about qualitative research, this is just maybe something that you already heard, but many forms of qualitative research are what we call cyclic or iterative processes. So you start doing the research, you start gathering data, and then you analyze your data, and then you go back because you need new data. So you look at the data, you analyze them, and then you see that you don't have enough data, or you miss data on specific subjects. So, and then you go back to it. Usually, if you look at quantitative research, you do a one-time. So you send a survey, and then you get it back in, and then you analyze, and that's it. Qualitative research is different. It's repetitive, so you have to go very often. So we were talking about this. Usually, when we have PhD students, we make sure that they do at least 2 cycles of data. So they go back and do a next data round, because often and that's because qualitative research, the analysis is not after data collection, but while you're collecting data. So the analysis is directing the data, further data collection. And what's very important about qualitative research also is that the researcher needs to be reflexive about their own role. it's a bit linked to the question you asked about bias in taking ethical decisions. You need to be aware of the fact that you have biases and that you have beliefs and norms. And if you look at other people, they may have completely different norms, and you may have a tendency to listen to the things that are similar to what you think and forget the things that are not similar. So you have to be reflexive, think about that. And for instance, make notes about how you think you were influencing your own data collection. It's important to be reflexive about your own role. Next one. I think some of you are doing mixed methods ways of doing research, and that's often so you can do different methods. They're really usually a very good, very important idea to do mixed methods. So not only take qualitative or not only quantitative, but do mixed methods research. And then you combine qualitative and quantitative methods. And I'll give you an example about how we do that in some studies in the Netherlands. So you can start with a qualitative study to generate a hypothesis for a quantitative study, because that's another difference between quantitative and qualitative. Usually qualitative studies are not hypothesis directed. They're explorative, so they don't have an hypothesis, but they can generate a hypothesis doing quantitative research later. So that's one of the ways. And what we also often do is we do a quantitative study, and there are some points we may not understand, or some relationships we do not understand, and then we do a qualitative study to understand what's happening. So maybe I think the next is an example, I hope. Yes. So the example type, what did you do? So that's an example of a study where we started out with a quantitative study, because in the Netherlands, probably euthanasia is legalized under certain conditions. And what we do every 5 years is that we do a quantitative study into the number of end-of-life decisions that are taken in the Netherlands. And it's both euthanasia, but also about other decisions, such as palliative sedation. I don't know if you know what palliative sedation is. It means that you bring someone in a coma when that person is dying, to treat, in fact, essentially to treat the symptoms. But it may also shorten the life of that person to some extent. And so that what we found in one of the quantitative studies, I think years ago or 10 years ago, there was a remarkable increase in palliative sedation numbers. Physicians used palliative sedation a lot more. And because we didn't understand why that was and what the reasons were that the physician had for that, we did a qualitative study in which we discussed cases with physicians. And so that's what we call a nested study. It's a qualitative study inside a quantitative study, which is one form of doing a mixed method. So it's qualitative research, not intended to generate a hypothesis, but intended to understand your quantitative findings better. Okay, is that clear, or is that? Do I explain clear enough, or is do you still think what's he talking about? We have no idea what he's talking about. Yeah, if it's clear enough. So this is one way you can use methods. And the other way is that you use it to generate a hypothesis for. So, for instance, you could also start doing qualitative interviews about palliative sedation, and then test the hypothesis about the reason why it's increasing. That's the other one. Yeah, I hope it's clear. Right. Okay, next group. So this is another example of a nested qualitative study that we did a number of years ago. One of my PhD students was involved in this study. And this was part of a very big randomized trial that was done by the geriatrics department. And it was about delaying or preventing functional decline in older citizens in their homes. So they did a trial with 3 interventions. I'm not going to explain, I couldn't even maybe, but 3 interventions which they tried out in the community in a randomized trial. So that was completely quantitative. And they wanted to see the effectiveness of those interventions. But they said that as a part of that cluster randomized trial, there was a qualitative study into looking into what the best moment is to start talking with elderly people about advanced care planning. We were talking a few days ago about advanced care planning, but this is so advanced care planning is that you talk with someone about what the kinds of treatments that they would want at the end of life and the kinds of treatments that they would not want anymore. So many people say at the end of their lives, at least in the Netherlands, that they don't want to go to an intensive care unit anymore, or they even don't want to go to hospital. And so those things you can discuss in an advanced care planning. And the questions that we had is, should it be dependent on age, or should you do that kind of planning conversations with patients when they're above 70, or should it be dependent on when they get worse? So that as soon as you see symptoms increasing, that you start doing this, and or should you only do it when patients ask for it? But then you can probably wait very long because patients often don't ask. So that's another example of how you can do nested qualitative ethical research within a quantitative, bigger type of research. The mixed methods. So this is an image. There's a bit more. If you do the next one will show new lines. So the question is, at what point in the disease process should we discuss the limitations of a curative approach? Can we do that, and what's the appropriate point? And that's an ethical question, because it's the point we start talking with patients about the end of life and about their values and about what they find important at the end of their life. So that's all right. So the next one. So now you can go to the next one. This is an explanation. So this let's look at another example, which is completely qualitative. So where we did research into qualitative, and in fact, it was a study about. In fact, it was a study about the ethics of research. So this is an interesting, I find it interesting example about how you do ethics research. This was an ethicist who was following a researcher and looking at the ethical decisions the researcher took. So they were not looking at patients, but at research. And so it's an empirical study in the ethics of research. And this was about a sociological study in palliative care, where they wanted to have a view of how the personality of people may change at the end of their lives. And the problem was that they did a 10 months participant observation. So the researcher was a registered nurse who was working in the hospital and was doing a sociological study at the same time. And one of the ethical problems they felt was that it was not clear if the patients and the families knew she was doing research. So it was a problem about informed consent. So what the research was looking at is how do they deal with informed consent? Especially because it was a very long-term thing. So they explained in the beginning, but very often patients would completely forget because you look not like a researcher, but like a nurse. So that was in fact the ethical question. How do you make sure that patients still know that they're in a research project and that this is different from regular care? And what they found out is that the researcher tended to ask like every second or third encounter. She asked, do you still agree that I do the research with you? And I think that's an appropriate way of maintaining informed consent. So that's another empirical qualitative research project that also led to guidelines about how to do informed consent in this type of studies. Because we sometimes tend to forget, and patients tend to forget. The next one, please. I think what's very important, if you look at the difference between quantitative and qualitative research, it's usually the difference between explaining how things happen and understanding how they happen. And I would be happy if that's the distinction that you keep in mind after this lecture. Do you do the research to explain how things happen, or do you do it to understand what happens? So explaining is looking for causal relationships. So it may, in ethical issues, it may look at causal relationships, why people talk about death. And it shows that it's something like a natural law. And for instance, what we found in some studies is that female doctors had less trouble talking about death than male. At least that was the case in the Netherlands. I don't know if it's the case here, but that statistical relationship was quantitative. It was an explanation of a difference. It explained explained how what was behind the differences that we found. And understanding is different. It shows how a phenomenon fits with its context. So how if you understand someone, you understand the life story of someone, or you understand what's important for that person. It's often comparative. So for instance, you may, in a qualitative study, when you ask a physician why that he or she didn't talk about death with him, you may understand it if that physician just went through a difficult bereavement period. And that's more understanding than causal relationship. You understand why that was the case. Next one. Next one. This is the big, like again. So let me go to a next one, because I want to just to explain to you again why do we do and why do we prefer to do qualitative research in ethics, is because it describes the context of the phenomenon, so you get more understanding. It reflects the complexity of social reality. You often do that in quantitative research. It responds to what I call the richness of human behavior. So there's so much variety in human behavior. If you do a quantitative study, you almost always look at average behavior, and you lose the variety. And if so to get a good image, you also need the variety, and that's what you see in qualitative research. I think maybe the most important thing is that it gives voice to people. Mm-hmm. So if you investigate and interview, let's say, rural patients in a backward area about the care they receive, it gives them a voice. Mm-hmm. And it does so more than if you fill in a list of questions. If you talk about their concerns, about their worries, And I think that's the main advantage of qualitative research. It gives voice to the people who don't have a voice. So the underprivileged. And I think that's why that's maybe the deepest reason why ethics, I think qualitative research is the best way of doing things. Next one. So there are different approaches. You can, in qualitative research, in ethics, there are different approaches, but I think you know all about this already. You can do in-depth interviews, or you can do group interviews, or focus groups. And you can do observations, so sit in practices. And one of the more recent forms of observation is looking at online communities. So you can look at what they do online. So you don't have to sit in, we can do it from an online communities. So you can do it participant and non-participant, and you do mixed method, but I already talked about that. So the next one. Next one. So I want to, the last 5 or 10 minutes, I'd like to speak about a few different approaches in qualitative research that you may be using already or that you can use, but just to give you a little overview of what the possibilities are, with very brief examples. So the first form of qualitative inquiry is what we call narrative inquiry. So it's essentially to understand over time, to understand the lives of people in certain situations, or to follow patients through their disease trajectory. To focus on it focuses on what happened to people. So it's really their stories. It's really you try to elicit their story. One of the very interesting ways of doing narrative research, and you can use that in bioethics a lot, is by having them keep diaries. So diaries may be a very important and very fruitful research tool if you want to know what the narrative of a patient is, for instance. So an example of a narrative inquiry is could address a certain minority group and how they live in a majority environment. And one of the examples sometimes discussed with students is about the way Chinese immigrants live in a Canadian context, which is a bit different. So the aim is really to elicit stories. So that maybe, as I say, biographical stories like diaries or testimonies, and the methods that you use, well, I already mentioned those. Autoethnographies is a bit complex, I think, but interviews and diaries are the most common ways of doing narrative research. And if you do that, if you want to know more about a temporary sequence of things that happen to people, then your way of writing will also be more like stories. So most narrative studies don't use the usual introduction, method, results, discussion part, but they will be more narrative themselves as well. It's not obligatory, but that's what they usually do. So the analysis is really focusing on storylines. So they describe storylines through, let's say, end of life care. So this is narrative. Does anyone of you do narrative inquiry following patients? We did a study it's not on my slide, but we did a study on people who had terminal heart failure and about how they were thinking. So their heart was, so they were close to death, and they had more and more, especially pulmonary problems. And we were looking at how they still were able to enjoy life in general. And then we did that throughout the last 2 years of their lives. We didn't know that beforehand, of course, but we had terminal heart failure patients. So usually they died within a year, and we followed their trajectory and described it and also drew conclusions from it. So that's the first negative inquiry. And then the second list, yeah, that's phenomenological inquiry. It's a difficult word, so this you should practice every night. Phenomenological, and say it quickly. Try to. So it's a very difficult word, and it's saying something very simple. It's usually a one-time thing, but what you want to describe is experience of people related to a particular phenomenon. So let's say grief can be something that you do phenomenologically. So you just describe, you have no hypothesis, you just ask people, what are you living through this period of grief? And you describe what they tell you. So you describe the phenomenon. It's getting a little bit different. Yeah, thank you. No. So, and one of the most important things here is what they call bracketing. So putting between brackets. So you put your own ideas, what hope is, for instance, you try to put them aside and just listen to what other people tell you about how they see hope and what hopes are important for them, and if hope is important at all. And so what you usually do for phenomenological inquiry is interviews, in-depth interviews, and they may take a long time. They may often be an hour, 2 hours, and so that's phenomenology. The difference with narrative inquiry is mainly the fact that it's not time. That's not over time, but usually you have one interview with someone who's describing what he's thinking about hope and what's important about hope, and you often write it well the classical way. You introduction, literature, method, results, and then discussion. Okay, next one. So then there's another method, and that's, I think you may have heard about it also. It's what they call grounded theory. And that goes a bit further because it is focusing not on describing a phenomenon, just describing what people say about hope, but about making a theory from those descriptions. So it's in fact a theoretical extension of phenomenological inquiry, you could say. So it's making an explanation. So you could say, what is the explanation of the way in people in which you can develop a healthy lifestyle? So you can make a theory about that. And so the method is that you constantly compare between interviews, and you also adapt your interviews to the theory that's in development. So you have a theoretical framework, and then you do interviews, you adapt the theoretical framework, and you do interviews again to see if it works, and then you adapt it again. It's a method, you a constant comparison between your analysis, the theory you're making, and the data. It's a very laborious way of doing it, but it usually gives very beautiful theories and very explanatory. It's for understanding. It improves understanding. So you go back and forth between analysis and data all the time. All right. I have of this. So we're almost at the end. So, and then a different approach is doing ethnography. You may have heard about that. Ethnography is essentially an anthropological, so it's Musimi's type of approach, I would say. It's an anthropological type of approach where you, in fact, look at what people do. You can also interview them, but the main distinction is you look at what they do. You also can ask them afterwards why they do what they do, but in fact, you're looking at practices, the way people practice. If I'm not correct, we'll see we correct me, but this is what we, and in fact, the central question is not what do people think, or what image do they have, or what is their life story, but it's maybe just what is going on. Yeah. So that's what you want to know, what's going on. So you may look at, for instance, a palliative care department. You sit in for maybe a month or two, and you just watch what's going on an ICU department or whatever, wherever you are feeling that you have to do research. And you can also, the example that I gave of the registered nurse was a form of ethnography that's called participant observation, which means that this nurse was also doing nursing work at the same time. So during doing the nursing work, she was both participating and observing what was happening. And so the way you do that is that you participate and then you withdraw from time to time to write up your notes, and then you get into the field again or into the ward again, and you do the work you need to do, and then you write it down again. So very beautiful descriptions. Usually the methodology here is described also in that way. So we did this and then we went back. I'm not sure if you do that. In fact, what it needs is someone who has two formations. So they need to be healthcare professionals and researchers. So a purely anthropological researcher is usually not a participant because they don't have the skills of the healthcare work. But nurses can do this, and doctors can do it. My dissertation was a bit of participatory. I did my dissertation in general practice because I'm a general practitioner in origin, and so I was looking at general practice while also being a practitioner. I observed my own and the practice of other GPs, our colleagues, and participating in the practice. So, and the interesting thing is that you get really what's often called thick descriptions. You have a maximum of detail about what's going on if you do observational studies for some time on what people do, on their emotions, also on their reasons, and on the web of relationships that are around their actions. So that's ethnography. I think if you want to, in the AMC or Amsterdam Department of Bioethics, we do a lot of ethnographic research. Because one of the professors is an ethnographer also. She's doing that a lot. So the next one. Oh, that was an example. We did a study, advanced home care technology. I mean, we have in the Netherlands, we can have people on respirators. Oh, it's time.
No.
Oh, yeah, it is time. So I'm almost at the end. I can reassure. Thank you very much for the wake up call. Wherever it came. So what we wanted to know is what ethical questions come up in advanced home care. So if you have people at home with a respirator or with a respirator, what ethical questions come up? So that was a very broad question. And we did videos, but also observations. So we just sat in with families who were dealing with, and it's very often very burdensome for families to have patients with artificial respiration, which is really medical high tech, in their homes. And one of the issues that came up were responsibilities of family members. They sometimes get very, very heavy responsibility, and they need to take very serious decisions sometimes about what happens to their patients. So that was one of the ethical issues that we discussed and addressed, and it led also to recommendations about the support of families dealing with people who have this technology at home, which is, I think, a good development, the fact that they can have it at home, but it also raises ethical issues about responsibilities and about burden to families. So that's one example which is living, in a sense, a bit with these families. So next, please. And that's the last thing. And that's a study. It's not completely different from the others because you also look at a phenomenon, but you probably look more also at the context. You use multiple sources. So if you look at a case study, you take one example of something that needs to be studied. A very good example was a study, but we didn't do that ourselves, but it was a study of how campuses in the US reacted to shootings. Because it's a big problem in US universities and high schools that sometimes there are shootings. And what they in the study wanted to know about one case of such a study about how the people in the campus, what it did to the people on the campus, the other people who were present, who were looking at it. And so that's how they, that's what you call a case study. If you do multiple sources and do what they call triangulation, so you have different sources that you get your data from. One case of a serious event. So it's really, that's event related. So those are the 5 forms of qualitative research that you could use depending on the question. So it's always very important. The method should be appropriate to the type of questions that you have. And that's why I mentioned the questions also. If you look at the method, you can look at methods, but the main is that they should fit in with the question. I think I'm almost at the end. No, I'm not going to do that one. I'm going to go to conclusion. Yeah. So I think the conclusion for me, at least, is that research in ethics is crucial. I consider ethics to be scientific and not only a philosophical or theological discipline. It's a scientific discipline, very close to anthropology, sociology, and to healthcare, of course, too. And I think ethical research, it's difficult to imagine ethical research without at least, which is not at least partly qualitative, because ethics is so dependent on understanding things. So doing only quantitative research, where you have statistical relationships between phenomena, doesn't give you understanding. So you usually need to make, I know no examples where we didn't do at least some qualitative parts too. And so it may use different approaches, and maybe often we use different approaches in the same. So it's usually, very often it's mixed methods. And it may be, the mix may be a mix of qualitative methods, but it may also be a mix of qualitative and quantitative methods, as I've tried to show you a little bit. And the bottom line, I think that's the green one. I think that ethicists should be also skilled researchers. And I hope that's one of the things you learn in the bioethics master, also to become a little bit already a skilled researcher. So that was, in fact, that's maybe the main conclusion there. Ethics needs these researchers, not only philosophers and theologians. They're also important, but you need also to be researchers. So that was the last.
Thank you for today's sharing. Any question before? Yeah. Okay, many questions today. So, please.
Thank you, Prof, today. It was enriching and very clear. Thank you. My question, how about action research and participatory action research in bioethics research?
Right.
What is your opinion? Thank you, Prof.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for that question. I didn't mention it explicitly in the forms, in the different methods that we have, but we increasingly use action research as a way of doing ethics because it allows you to at the same time do the research and try to improve the practice. So what in the traditional studies, we usually did the study and then we gave recommendations, and then other people had to do had to do the recommendations. What we now increasingly do is that we are collaborating with people who are in the practice and are trying to change the practice, and we do the research as a parallel at the same time. I'll give you an example of a project, but very briefly, a project that we're involved in for about, I think, 3-4 years now. And that's about the use, originally it was about the use of artificial intelligence in deciding which patients should have a cardiac defibrillator. Do you still understand? It's a bit technical. It's about patients who had a myocardial infarction and who survived, but are at a high chance of getting another one. And so the question is, do you give a cardiac defibrillator? And what we're doing is that we're working at what we call embedded ethicists. And that's another term you might want to remember. We are doing a lot of research as embedded ethicists, which means that we're part of a project that is trying to improve the practice. And we do, and that's a form, I think, of action research. One of the examples here, and so we are embedded in this cardiology project to see how the to raise and to solve the ethical issues that come up if you use artificial intelligence to co-decide who gets the defibrillator and who doesn't. So that's one form of action. The other one I just mentioned was the clustered randomized trial, where they try to improve the functional decline in elderly people. And there we were involved also as ethicists to solve the ethical questions that came up with new interventions. So thank you very much. I think action research is really part of it's really a very good complete. It makes it more complete. Yeah, thank you so much. And next presentation will also have action research. I promise. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Professor Deep. It's really insightful, and now I'm getting more clear and clearer of your comments today. So I want to ask you so as a bioethicist or bioethics researcher, to separate between skill that we have and the emotion, or we need to include our emotion in this research when we conduct, let's say, if we already conduct good and integrity research, and we met the participant, let's say it's the patient, and what is it? We already give the voice to them, and how far this voice from the patient can be heard from our research. Thank you.
Thank you again. Yeah, very, very good and very thoughtful question. Let me respond to. I think you should never pose. Well, how to say? If you do qualitative ethics research, you're never a researcher. You can do statistics at a distance, but if you do good qualitative research, you're involved in what you're studying. So I think if you need to have the skills to do it, one of the skills, and that's what I would say, one of the skills is how you deal with your emotion. So you need to learn to you can't escape them because they're there. But what you need to learn is how do you deal with your emotions in doing the research. It links very much to your question about your subjective bias. So you have these emotions and also biases. So what you do is describe them, make them part of your data. So you describe that you were talking about a patient who had a very moving story about, I don't know, bereavement or about the way things went. And then what you do is you make separate notes about how that affected your emotions, because it does affect you. One of the skills that you need to have, I think, is also limit your involvement to some extent. It reminds me of a discussion that we had with Mas Bagas, who is from Purwokerto, who did a PhD in Amsterdam. And he was doing a PhD into family involvement in palliative care in rural areas in Banyumas. And so he was also doing interviews. He went to these people, he did interviews, and he was often very moved by what he saw. And one of his first intuitive responses was trying to help these people, even by giving them money or like that, or intervening in other ways. And that's a very difficult thing because you can't keep doing that as a researcher. So you have to develop the skill to give a place to your emotions without becoming a caregiver and without becoming too involved. So some distance you need, and the way to do that, and it's similar to the answer I gave to your question about subjective bias. The way to do that is once is to write down the effect that it has on your emotions, and the second one is to discuss it in a group. Again, you don't do this alone. If you do it alone, it's very difficult to deal with it. But you have your research group also to discuss the emotional part of doing the research. Because you're quite right. If you do these types of studies in usually very sensitive areas, then your emotions get into play, and you can't act as if they're not there, because that will distort your data. So you have to realize it, be explicit about them, and also think about the borders of your involvement. And finally, obviously, didn't give money, but he said, I felt it was so terrible when I saw it, and these people were so poor. But then you still have to say, I'm a researcher, and it shouldn't influence my research needs. But they're still there, so you can't switch them off. You can't switch your emotions off. You should never try that. But write them down, give them a place. I don't know if that helps, but that's the way we try to deal with that. It's a very important issue. It's also the reason why some researchers don't like doing qualitative research, because it gets too emotional for them. If you do statistical research, or if you do desk research, reading old philosophers, for instance, it's not that emotional. Yeah. So thank you for the question.
Okay.
So in a way, it's like a declaration, yeah?
Yeah.
Explicitly.
It's like an explicit declaration. It's not a declaration of interest,
No.
but it's a declaration of emotion.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So one of the skill as a bioethics researcher is dealing with what is it, with our emotion itself. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And knowing that you have them, and also discussing them with your colleagues, with a trained colleague. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. We have one more question from student. Okay. Yeah. Thank you, Prof. My name is Tita. My background is a doctor. I'm interested in hope value in terminal patient. Okay. My question is, how can we provide hope value in terminal patient while we know that the prognosis for the patient is not good enough? And is it enough just in palliative care only? Because as I know, in Indonesia, palliative care is rarely implemented. Thank you.
Thank you very much again. That's also a very thoughtful question. So we had exactly this question when we did the research that I was talking briefly about. So how do you deal with hope in patients, and how do you maintain hope? Because hope is essential for people, even though the prognosis is bad and they know they're going to die. That's why we did the research. So my first answer would be do research. That's how I said. I tried to say that you can give an answer from books, but I think it's very important to do to ask people how the people who are experienced in doing this, how they do it, and also do research among patients and families who have a terminal patient, who are in a terminal condition, and what they find important about hope. And what we found in the study is that what was most helpful for people was not to deny the hope. So it's not denying, not saying you're hoping for something, but stop hoping because the future is gloomy and you will die, and so stop hoping. So, but what was helpful it was helping them to shift their hope to another issue. So not hoping for cure anymore, not hoping to resume the life that you had before, but hoping for something that is still possible. Let's to have joy in things that are still possible. And that's, I think, the main thing you can do that, and it came from our research. That's why I think it's so important for research things, is that you can help patients shift their hope to an area where it's not unrealistic, where you can still have realistic hopes. So, but taking away the hope is the approach that many doctors in our research also had, and they felt very bad about it. And patients were, and especially families, were often angry about it because they said, "But this doctor is terrible. You take my father still has hope, and that's the only thing he lives for." And then this says, "Stop hoping." So that's not the way to go. So it's maintaining hope, but giving it maybe an target, trying to move it to a different, deflect it to a different time.
Okay, so it's kind of we have to redefine what kind of hope itself for patient, yeah, Prof. Yeah, not only talk about cure, but also how the patient can accept and feel life completion in their end of stage in their life, have joy and happiness in their life, even though it's the last phase of their things.
Yeah.
More comment? Done? Enough? Okay. Any other questions from student?
From staff.
Oh,
From staff.
The team is yeah.
Okay.
Ada yang online kah? Tak ada.
Thank you. A question from ex-student of Prof. Willems, and yeah. So thank you, Prof. Dick, for the presentation and so many new insights for us. So I was interested in when you said when you have a big topic that is too big, and then you research it, and then in the end, it's like you research about nothing, or maybe the result is a bit vague or something like that. But we come from different backgrounds, many from health, but not everyone. And then, for example, in public health, it might be the question of, for example, diabetes like that. And then we come to bioethics and ask a more specific question. So how can it help for us to see how specific our research question should be? Because I think we tend to have a big question with many sub questions and not realizing that it is really big. So do you have some suggestions? Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, well, what I think is that you have to specify a question so that you can imagine what information that you need to solve it. So that's in fact the central thing you do. So you may give you if you have a question and you don't have an idea about the type of information that will give you an answer, then your question is too broad. So it's really a sort of a mental a training to make a question which is answerable. So you need to have a question that that allow it. So you have a question that you can answer. And a very big question like, I don't know, but you have a very big question. How should we organize healthcare? It's too big. It's too, and whatever you do will never have an answer. That's why what I mean by it's about nothing. Is it's finally, it will disappear. So you have to specify more and more. You know, the problem with research is always small steps. You cannot solve a very big question in one step. You always have small steps, but then again, it should be a question that you solve. But it's also, and that's usually important. It's also in your. Let me say it this way: if you do a qualitative study, you will have to think about who you involve because you can't have everybody. So you have to make a purposive sampling, as we call it. And in that purposive sampling, you also think about the sampling that will. The sampling has to be in a way so that other people can learn from you too, even if in a different context. So the one thing is that you try to ask a question that's answerable, but it's also a question that people in different contexts can learn from. So that's how you make it a little bit bigger than very small question that you're able to answer. I'm not sure it's clear because it's quite abstract, but you should choose there. And we also, while we're always very why purposive sampling is so important. Because if you want to study a phenomenon, you can do it all within one context. That can be very valuable, but that's a case study. That's what we call a case study, usually. But if you have a question, you also want it to be useful for other people, for people in different areas of the world, different contexts. And that's a question that you ask. And that's why you do purposive sampling. So, for instance, if you're talking about, let me try to think about an example with hope. What we did, the purposive sampling we did, was that we wanted to include people of different religious backgrounds to be able to say something more. We could have chosen just Christian people or just atheistic people or or maybe even other denominations, but we try to make the purpose of sampling a bit big because we hope that through making a bigger sample for our specific question, we can address other people as well. So that's the relationship between, I think, qualitative, very local and small research, and the bigger questions. It's for the purpose of sampling too. So your question needs to be specific, and your sampling needs to be purposeful. Yeah, a little bit. Your question is very good. It's because it's a very good question that the answer may be a bit, well, so that's how we do it.
Thank you, Prof. It really helped to shape
Okay.
research question. This would help also for students who will start research soon.
Yeah, I think
Shaping the research question.
yeah, basically, I can't even reformulate. If you want to do your research, you want that people can learn from your research, and ask yourself the question: which people do I want to learn from? Which people do I have in mind to learn from the research that I'm doing? And that is what directs your purpose of sampling.
So actually, the reason why I asked this question is because, like, of my worry, actually, that there was an example of a research that I don't mention, but researching about four principles in a certain settings for principles of Buchom and Childress. And when I asked how you will find out about this, I will ask the stakeholders, how do you practice beneficence and non-maleficence? And that's divine specific, but it's like, so directly asking about that, how do you practice respect for autonomy? How to practice it? So, and it may be because of, I don't know, but because of a worry that it might be in some cases like that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Oh yeah.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Dewi. Maybe it's also my problem, how to make a specification in research, yeah. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much for Prof. Dick William, who gave a very helpful session today. I believe it will give a good impact for all of us, especially for students. I see that they already come back to their own thesis research plan, right? Because Prof. Dick mentions many type of question, yeah, and we have to make a very clear and specific, and you have to do that, yeah, and there are many kind of approach to conduct a research, and in this and today we learn about qualitative research, many things. We can do narrative until case study, yeah, it's depend on your plan, what kind of things you have to do, yeah.
On your
And-
question, it's some question.
The important thing is the case question, yeah, from your question, specific question. I also the kind of specific question, causal question, value question, ethics question. Yeah, we have to explore in a detail. Yeah, and Prof. mentioned next time we will discuss more about action research. We will waiting for you, Prof. for that session to meet with our students again. So thank you very much, Prof. for today's section. And as a symbol of appreciation, we would like to Bu Sili to give a placard for Prof. Yeah, thank you very much for great contribution in Master of Bioethics for yesterday's session in guest lecture and also today's in bioethics teaching.
Thank you so much.
You can open it, Prof.
Isn't that beautiful?
Yeah, it's our The
Yeah.
Building,
The
yes,
building, you say.
building here. Beautiful. Thank you very much, Prof.
Yeah, let me say thanks to you because I liked your questions very much. Really good. Really good. Yeah.
Continue with
Yeah.
research question, yeah, Prof.
Yeah.
Research question, okay, yeah.
They start to think about research question.
Thank you so much for this. It was my
Okay.
pleasure to do. Really.
Okay, and we invite all students and all staff to take a picture together with Prof. Dick here. Teman-teman media yang di luar boleh dipanggilin ya.
Ah, this is the